Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Green. I'm the general editor for the new Polis, and this is another critical conversation. And today we have Philip Goodchild and Devin Singh. There are fuller bios for each of our participants today on the website, and so I'm not going to read over that, but I will just say very briefly. Philip Goodchild is professor of religion and philosophy at University of Nottingham. And he has an expertise in continental, especially French philosophy and its relation to religion. And he's the author of a current series. I only have the first two right now because the third one is not out, although I've been able to read it, of a series of books under the title of Credit and Faith. So there's Credit and Faith, Economic Theology, and the most recent edition, which is out this summer, is Metaphysics of Trust. Devin Singh is an associate professor of religion at Dartmouth, and he studies religious thought in the modern West and sites of colonial encounter with attention to the Christian tradition and its interaction with economy and politics. And he's the author of Divine Currency, The Theological Power of Money in the West. And I think just to kind of frame things a little bit today, having read these books, Devin's book is very much about, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Devin, but an earlier period. It's about the kind of reception of Christianity by the Roman Empire, by Constantine, and how it becomes institutionalized, I would say, as a religion. And Philip's books, and even his earlier book like Theology of Money, is very much dealing with the modern period and the creation of the English bank, for example, in that transition into the capitalist era. And so as a sort of bridge, like I think these two thinkers are really help us to reconceive in a really unique way the ways that we think about economy and money. A lot of Devin's book deals with reconceiving, for example, the discussions that Michel Foucault and Giorgio Agamben have had, and they have such like intellectual currency in the world, and so I think Devin's book is really helpful at digging deeper into the nuances of those projects, and I find Philip's recent project entirely original and unique, and he's like it shifts from different books, so I can't give a really good account, but very much in the first book, like rethinking what thought is and how thought works, and then maneuvering in a really eloquent way, I think, into what we mean by trust, and who perhaps gets trusted in the current world, and there's some, well, I'm adding a little bit by saying who gets trusted. So I'm not going to say too much more about that, but I feel like these two projects really complement each other. So as a way to open things up, I might just have Devin and Philip kind of explain in their own words kind of what their projects are about. And then I'll turn things over to Carl Raschke from the New Polis as well, and let him moderate, because Carl's work definitely intersects with Philip and Devin's work. So thank you all for being here. And well, I'll ask Devin first, just because I have a historical mind and because you're dealing with an earlier period a little bit. So maybe we'll start with you, Devin.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Roger, for that introduction and that opening. And thank you, Roger and Carl, for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. And it's wonderful to be in conversation with Philip and all of his important and groundbreaking work. I will talk a bit about Divine Currency. I'm also eager to talk about my current book project, which the working title is Sacred Debt, which aligns with many of the concerns and inquiries that Philip is undertaking. And so in many ways, I think what will also be, hopefully a good sense of dialogue and conversation there. But just to sort of talk a little bit about divine currency, particularly in light of the sort of historical trajectory that Roger has laid out for us. As Roger noted, I liken it to, I call it archaeology. It's participating in a genealogical sort of study, but it's not itself a genealogy. It's an archaeology in the sense of it looking at a snapshot in a longer potential narrative that one could imagine or trace of the lingering effects of this fusion of economy with theology that happens in many sites, but I look at particular sites within Christianity and Christian thought. One, would have to do a much larger, more meticulous sort of historical work, I think, to trace how that leads towards certain issues in modernity, with attention to the medieval period and whatnot in particular. But I ground this in late antiquity, and so looking at the 300s to the 600s, 700s. And part of why this is an interesting era for me is that this is sort of the beginnings of kind of a formally codified theology. Certainly there's theology implicit and at work in the biblical texts, as well as in the early church and in the so-called apostolic and early church fathers. But in this patristic period, this is when we have the codifications brought on by empire, right, with conciliar sorts of agreements through these ecumenical councils. We have emperors that are lending their weight and their imperial weight behind certain doctrinal agreements and alignments. And so it's an interesting moment of fusion of theology, politics, and, as I focus on in this book, economics. And as Roger noted, there are interesting ways that these early theologians are looking at the economy around them, the Greco-Roman administration, the operation of currency and coinage, the prevalence and presence of debt slavery, the use of economy in conquest as the Roman Empire encounters so-called barbarians on its borders. All these things provide interesting tropes, metaphors, conceptual schemas for theologians to say, this is what God is doing. God is doing these things in the cosmos through conquering the devil, through economy, through purchasing humanity back from a kind of spiritual or cosmic debt slavery, whether to the devil or to some unseen demonic forces. This is what salvation means, right? I look at early ransom theory, which is the sort of most prevalent kind of articulated theology or soteriology in the early church, which is this theory of humanity being in some sort of bondage, typically construed as debt bondage, to Satan, to death, to some sort of powers, or sometimes to God in God's self, which is an interesting sort of twist. And Christ is the currency. Christ is the redemptive payment that liberates humanity. And we still have this language, of course, of redemption that operates very centrally in Christian thought, often in sort of ways that practitioners forget the meaning of the metaphor and think it just sort of means synonymously something like forgiveness, something like salvation. But I try to recall the actual economic context to it and the ways that economy is operating there. And this gets taken up in the ways that bishops then advocate for the poor and the ways that emperors style themselves as somehow representatives of divine economy, and the ways that theologians describe God using economic dynamics. Emperors then imagine themselves as models reduplicating that for the world. And so this contributes to what I see as a political theological template that gets handed down. And we can think about the ways that might then lead toward forms of sovereignty and governmentality in the modern world. And of course, this is one of Foucault and Agamben's trajectories, right? And part of what I try to add to that, particularly with someone like Agamben, who writes a whole book about economy and, in my opinion, doesn't really talk about economics, which I find very interesting. And so I try to actually say, well, yes, there's governance happening here and there's glory happening here, but what about the actual materiality? What about the exchanges and the economies that are happening there? And so to supplement as well as challenge some of Agamben's paradigms there. But a couple of things that emerged for me in this study, and these are things that Philip and I have talked about at length as well. One, that I focus on currency, I focus on money, but money is a symbol and a token of a much larger sort of reality, which is credit and debt, right? There are these credit and debt relationships that operate within society that operated for actually millennia before something like money emerges. And so it's not just about the money stuff, whether it's currency, cash, coins, or other tokens, but something called the money of account, the system of weights and measures and proportions, the limitations and tabulations and regulations under some sort of centralized power, some sort of centralized authority. And we often use the term sovereignty to denote this. So there's a link between money, debt, and sovereignty that I find that I think is generative and important to explore. And that's something I, in some ways, end on in the book. And so that's one of the launching points for my next project. I also end on this theme of debt playing a profound role in the Christian imagination. It's central to these theories of ransom and redemption that I explore, where humanity again is in some sort of debt slavery or debt bondage. But of course, it emerges in language of Jubilee with debt cancellation and debt forgiveness, which becomes this metaphor for spiritual forgiveness as well. But this forgiveness is economized, as is the language of grace. And we see this in Paul in the New Testament playing with language of gift, but also wage and payment. So there's just a litany of various economic tropes and metaphors and concepts that certainly some have given attention to, but there's a lot more there to explore, and as well as the language of gratitude and obedience that are often couched in terms of a debt that's owed to God. And this is something that certainly Calvin is known for, and some of the other reformers who want to say that, well, salvation is not about works, you don't earn it, but there's still an obedience and a faithfulness that must emerge, and it's construed as a debt of gratitude that one needs to pay to God. So there's operations of debt there in the Christian imagination that that I find also important to highlight, and that part of my conjecture and part of my intuition in this next project is that part of the power and sway and influence of debt in our contemporary moments. Certainly there are a number of studies emerging. Obviously, we can think about Graeber, we can think about Lazzarato, we can think about other philosophers and social theorists that are looking at the modern West, and in particular, we can of course think about it globally, as in some ways permeated by debt. We're saturated with debt as a structuring concept, as well as in the actual institutions within society. That Lazzarato talks about the subject born into debt, that the neoliberal subject, the subject of modernity, is born already in debt, and that indebtedness constrains our horizons of possibility, our horizons and trajectories of being. And so, I want to tease out some of the origins and roots of that. And of course, I think this religious and theological linkage to debt is certainly one source. And I make no claims to think it is the source or the only reason why debt is so pervasive. There are a number of reasons. But its linkage to these theological concepts that have structured the West and structured Western society and economy, I think, are important. I also think that debt, linguistically and conceptually, has sort of usurped its place. So I want to make the claim in this project, Sacred Debt, that debt is one of a variety of kinds of obligations. That really obligation is perhaps like a master category we should think about. And within that, we have relations of loyalty, of fealty or duty, of love, of gratitude, of gift, that all construe different ways that we might be obligated to one another. And debt is another one of those possibilities. And yet debt has sort of ballooned and emerged and colonized all these categories so that we speak about our obligations in terms of debt. And yet, I want to push back and say we often don't really mean debt when we say these things. When we talk about debts to parents, debts to society, debts to ancestors, debts to the gods, we don't mean that we have an arrangement where the value that we owe has been quantified and that we have an agreement to pay that back in some way, often with interest. And so we use the word debt to name this very discrete set of economic instruments that result from lending and loan agreements, which are very different than these other relationships. And so to speak about our debts that we owe to our parents don't make sense unless we intend to kind of quantify that obligation to our parents and then sever those ties through somehow repaying or extinguishing the obligations that we owe to that. And so debt provides the structuring logic to these obligations. And it provides a background condition for many assumptions about morality and justice. That our notions of morality and justice are often trade on ideas of compensation, that we're going to balance the scales, we're going to pay back what is owed, that are, early notions of an eye for an eye and these kinds of talionic reciprocities are ways of extinguishing debts, that by removing your eye, I've somehow incurred a debt. And so in order to pay back that debt, my eye needs to be removed. There's an economy of exchange that's assumed there in this equalizing logic of justice. And it also emerges in our assumptions of morality. A lovely essay that I want to plug in this, there's a book called The Debt Age, which I recommend and think is a lovely collection of essays. And one of the editors, Jeffrey DeLeo, has an essay in there where he engages Graeber in this concept of debt and morality, but he starts with the death of Socrates. And this cryptic, enigmatic statement that as Socrates lies dying, he basically is like, oh, hold on, before I die, don't forget, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Don't forget to go and make that payment, and then dies, right? So Socrates' dying breath is about somehow a debt owed to this god that needs to be atoned for in the sacrifice. And then he dies. Obviously, like we can discuss this ad nauseum. There are a lot of interpretations about what this is about. Why is this included here? But certainly one of the possibilities is that something like debt and owing structures notions of philosophy and justice here that Socrates is kind of the cipher and the stand-in for. And I think some of Philip's speculations, I think, are probing this in really interesting ways. Like, to what extent do categories of debt and repayment of obligation offer the categories of thought for philosophy as well as for ideas of justice? And that's what DeLeo problematizes, and he's also sparring a bit with Graeber in this essay. Graeber also notes that debt problematically structures our sense of morality, particularly in the West, but I think we can speak globally. And Graeber wants to rupture that and say, well, we need to think about morality and moral obligation in different terms. And DeLeo is sympathetic with that, but also doesn't think that we can escape debt as a structuring category. We're just too immersed in it. This is how we understand what it means to be just, what it means to be moral. So there's an interesting debate to think about there about what other kinds of terms and criteria we can use and draw on to construe notions of morality and ethics and justice that don't rely on this kind of economy of repayment, this economy of exchange. And we can talk about a variety of others. So I could go and kind of outline my chapters in terms of this book. I won't do that for the sake of time, but I will just talk about a few kind of overlaps that I explore in this book that I think are interesting. One is this conflation of debt and gift, the ways that debt and gift are often blurred, and many exponents and analysts of the gift will speak about the debt that the gift imposes. And part of why I find that problematic is that the language of debt and the language of gift mark two different types of exchanges, that we often use gift to mark informal or implicit reciprocities, that typically gifts denote things that are not, there may be obligation and it may be binding, but it's not something that's openly, explicitly stipulated. I've given you this gift, and therefore you must reciprocate at a later stage. It's implied, it's informal, it's implicit. Whereas debt is something that has become formalized and formally explicit. I'm lending you this amount of value, and this is a loss that I'm incurring, and that you need to pay me back at some point, often with something called interest, value added. Everyone agrees on this. It's enforceable by contracts, by witnesses, by oaths, various sorts of means. So some dynamic in the gift I think has been made explicit in the debt. So I do think that one can think about a genealogical relationship between debt and gift, that debt relations emerge as formalized and stabilized and legally enforceable elements of the gift, but they're not the same thing. And so I want to problematize and trouble that relationship as well in terms of that connection. And we can think about debt and sacrifice as well. So part of the reason I'm exploring these overlaps is that these play a major role in Christian thought as well as in other religious language. But sacrifice as well has this broad spectrum. Sacrifice can mean something like a shared or communal meal. It can be a demonstration of one-sided devotion. It can be a way to pacify wrath and appease. It can be a way to restore and reconcile. These are all cases or reasons given for why one might sacrifice. It can be a kind of tit for tat exchange, which has been explored in particularly the Roman notion of sacrifice. Or it can be compensatory and repaying, right? That you sacrifice, you shed blood in order to repay and pay back something. And it's this last notion that I think often has become sort of a dominant category and gets merged together in really interesting and problematic ways in Christian thought. We see in the New Testament in particular these two separate sorts of languages and economies. One of sacrifice, where sacrifice be cleansing, appeasing, paying back in some sort of, or not paying back, but cleansing and appeasing in a moral way. And then language of paying back that then get merged. And so that we have language of Christ's blood buying back humanity, which are the merging of these two separate ideas within Christian thought, that I think one can do a genealogy of carcerality and suffering and pain as paying back one's debt as linked in some ways to this language. And so that's one of the end goals of this project, is to think about the merger of these two economies. And of course, the whole regime of penance that emerges in the Middle Ages, I think, is tied to this, the idea that you can suffer and that you can incur pain as a way to pay back some sort of debt that one might be owed. And again, these are not self-evidently connected, but they have been merged and connected in Christian thought, as well as in a number of other traditions. There are a number of other sites I look at. Debt and guilt we can spend some time talking about. Of course, Nietzsche makes a lot of this. Benjamin, in his language of capitalism as a guilt religion, is playing with the slippage in Schuld, this German notion of debt and guilt that I think is important to think about as well, in terms of the ways that debt becomes moralized. So why is being in debt sometimes construed as being guilty, right? That we have this sort of moral layer that many of our societies put on indebtedness. Indebtedness could just be an objective sort of matter-of-fact thing. Okay, you're in debt, and yet there is this language of guilt and shame that's often attributed to being in debt. And there's something there with this merger with language of guilt that I think needs to be explored. Debt and sovereignty as well. And debt and reproduction is an interesting site that I also want to explore. The language of interest is often construed as money's unnatural reproduction, right? This is Aristotle, that interest is wrong because it's money giving birth to money. And so he has a very strong and stipulated notion of what counts as natural or acceptable reproduction and what is unacceptable or unnatural reproduction. So there's a whole ideologies of sex, gender, and reproduction and social reproduction that are at work in language of debt and indebtedness that I think also need to be teased out. And what sites in society become these sites that indebtedness gets reproduced, and also invisibilized. And then reparations. I think I'll end there, but thinking about the language of reparations, and this language of guilt and debt is key there. So a number of scholars have looked at this, the language of a kind of racial guilt that has been ascribed, particularly to Black folk, in the history of chattel slavery and the slave system, drawing on language of the curse of Ham and this kind of universal justification for slavery based on race. There's this imagination in early modernity that arguably goes back later, that people of color are to be enslaved as a kind of curse or condemnation, right? And so there's a sense in which there's an original guilt that Black folk have that justifies their enslavement. This then can get appropriated by slaveholders to say, therefore, this slavery, this enforced work is part of a way to pay back this guilt. And we see this language emerge very, very rampantly in this time period, that slavery and the suffering of slavery is going to be purifying, it's going to be redemptive, it's going to build your character, etc. But it's a way to pay back this original guilt. So unpaid labor then in slavery is paying back an original kind of guilt or debt that one owes, such that the reparations are nonsensical in this imagination, because there's no outstanding unpaid labor. That enforced labor of slavery was already there enforced to pay back this original guilt, this racial guilt. And so this is part of, I think, the conceptual resistance to reparations for some within the structures of white supremacy, is because Black folk and people of color are originally guilty, and that labor was to pay back this guilt. So there's nothing to repay. Why should we talk about reparations? And that gets transposed then to modern notions of criminality, right? That criminalization of people of color also justifies a resistance to reparations. So mass incarceration is brought in here as well. That these regimes criminalizing the darker races also undergirds a resistance to reparations. And I think also goes back to this curse of Ham and this original guilt language that many people of color bear. And so that's another example of a way that you can trace, I think, an interesting trajectory and movement of debt and guilt and other notions of obligation that I think has a real kind of political and social traction. So I'll wrap it up there. I mean, those are some sites that I'm thinking about. There are others that I can expound on as well, where I'm interested in going, and extremely thrilled about Philip's project and the questions he's asking. And there's a lot, obviously there that we can kind of tease out in our conversation together.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And as I'm transitioning over to Philip, I'm noticing that Joshua Ramey is in our discussion today. And I wouldn't know Devin if I hadn't known Joshua Ramey, who I've done interviews with on the new Polis, and he's been out to Denver before as well. And he's been doing a series, which is now in part 3 right now, on Insight seminars. It's Insight with a C. So I just want to give a plug for Joshua's current seminar. The current one starts tonight, and it's called Becoming Soil, but it's part of a larger series called For the Remains. And even if you're watching this later, you can generally find Insight seminars online and in a different asynchronous type of setting. So I'll turn it over to Philip now.
Put a link to that in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Joshua. Philip,
you're still muted.
Sorry. Thanks very much. You'll see how technically challenged I am as we go on. Thanks very much to Roger and Carl for setting this up. And thanks especially for everyone who's come along to join in a chat conversation. It's really valuable time to spend time talking about these issues surrounding debt. And Devin, whose work I've engaged with quite closely over the years, is quite an inspiration, whose work might keep me grounded, but I'm afraid that's impossible. I'm not very grounded at all. I'm going to share my screen if that works. Can you see that? Great. So the reason for using a slideshow is to keep me relatively brief, so I don't keep rambling away, and just some visual pointers for what I'm talking about. So about over a decade's work has culminated in a book that fell into 3 because it was too long. So here we have Credit and Faith, Economic Theology, and the Metaphysics of Trust as 3 books. The last one, I confirmed this afternoon that all the proofs are done and it's all ready to go to printing now. So that should be out in July. If I could say a few words about how I got into this topic in the first place, I see myself as essentially a kind of philosopher, and key influences more recently it's been Bay, but originally Nietzsche and Deleuze. And I see myself as someone who's learned to think by studying their work, but also rewired my own brain so that I've become a rather different kind of being than most philosophers. And there's other important philosophers too. And this gives me a rounded view of a level of dissent, or a sense that the modern world is completely messed up because our thought is messed up, and our thought is messed up in relation to its basic concepts, its genres of writing, its images, what it means to think, the ways in which we engage in practices aimed towards aspiration and fulfillment, the privilege we give to certain accounts of material reality grounded on data and evidence, the way in which we allow everyday presuppositions to alter and control, well, to control and shape the way we do things. So I see myself as trying desperately hard to find ways of innovating in each of these dimensions. Really, it's a project to try and produce a new sort of philosophy, and it's been going on for about 25 years. I'm just going to have, of course, as many influences as I can possibly let myself have. But two key threads that I've been wandering around that have shaped the current project concern temporality and money. So around temporality, a lot of the philosophers I've been influenced by have been saying there is a new kind of thinking, and Rosenzweig said the new thinking takes time, needs another person, and takes time seriously, and that's what I'm trying to do here. Taking the point from Kierkegaard that life has to be understood backwards but can only be lived forwards, which he made a note of in his journals, it seems to me that nearly all our practices of thinking are somehow upside down or back to front or the wrong way round, or because they're essentially looking at a reality that is fixed, whereas our human existence is a matter of making reality in and through and as the rest of existence makes that reality too. And that involves spending time, distributing attention, investing care, to the point where the only life that we have is the life that we spend in our time, care, attention. So that's one thread that I've started pulling on, and I've been trying to work out the ramifications of. The other thread concerns money, and one neat way of summing it up is this point from Marx, from the 1844 manuscripts, that the difference between effective demand based on money and ineffective demand based on my need, passion, wish, etc., is the difference between being and thinking. So here I get the sense that philosophy is concerned with the relationship between being and thinking. But money intervenes in quite a special way, if not a unique way, in quite a special way between thinking and being, in order to bring being about, so you can get from thinking to being, but not in a way that you can do purely by yourself in imagination. So money can be thought along with all the other apparatuses that make up a modern economy, whether we're talking about rules, contracts, regulations, practices for audit, derivatives, financial products, etc., etc. They're all things that are created in and through the words that we say to agree them. So in some sense, they're in line with ritual. They're kind of interpersonal ritual that generates reality. Now, some 30 years ago, some of you might remember, everyone perhaps following Girard was talking about sacrifice to explain all things, and then following Derrida, questions of gift and reciprocity and forgiveness and economy came up. And I found these quite unsatisfactory as, I found these exciting in that they seem to be very specific phenomena that could be used to illuminate everything else. But I also found them quite unsatisfactory because they didn't illuminate everything. There were other things going on as well. So I started, when a lot of theologians were talking about the gift, or phenomenologists or philosophers of religion, I started pulling on this thread of economy and understanding economy, first of all, in the way it is presented to us as a market, and then thought, well, market depends on money, and started teasing out notions of money and turning it into capital, and then essentially into credit, and essentially into trust. So I've been pulling this thread for 25 years. And gradually, it's generated quite a different perspective from which many, many things can be thought out afresh and illuminated in a fresh light. So my aim is to try and understand why we're so confused and so messed up, and what is the gap between thinking and being, and how that can be reunited. How it's reunited in practice through things like money, even when it's not effectively reunited through our sciences, for example, and our models of reality. So, taking the power of money, after 25 years on this, I've concluded that it's not just some abstract thing that sits in money itself. It requires a definite context. You need a determinate currency. Carl on his wall has euros, but the money in general is nothing. Euros, dollars, pounds, yen, Swiss francs, they're all something. So you need a determinate currency backed by definite institutional arrangements. And a currency only has power, only has credibility, has credit and value, insofar as there is a consistent network of central banks, national treasuries, clearing banks, institutional actors, and individuals all doing their expected economic jobs in keeping the value of money alive. Secondly, money is created as debt in the modern world, and perhaps as it comes clear in Devin's work too, in the ancient world too, going back to the first examples of coinage by the tyrants of Lydia and Phrygia. Money involves the creation of determinate debt obligations. And unlike the way we normally think of it as something totally interchangeable with any other piece, one piece of money is the same as another, that's why we can use it as a standard of value. With debt obligations, you have a named debtor and a named person to whom the debt is due, whether these are individuals or bodies, and they have a specified amount of a currency, denominated a currency that's to be supplied, usually with a date specified, though that can be flexible or rolled and moved around. But if it didn't really exist, then it's the unusual situation of an infinite debt. But alongside that, you don't get the debt obligations unless someone has taken the risk of speculating on the future that it's going to be sufficiently predictable or manipulable in order to yield sufficient profit, resources, what have you, to make that debt repayable. Now, you see on the slide I put, you've got to situate the power of money within a determinate world. You need a determinate sense of self or identity or individuality. You also need some kind of orientation to the future. I mentioned credit and faith, if not God here. But here we're talking about metaphysics, the Kant's transcendental ideas, the world, self, and God. But what I'm trying to do in my work is a kind of metaphysics, essentially. It's a matter of thinking the relationship between thinking and being, but a metaphysics that takes its cases from actual events in the world or actual situations. So we understand the world in terms of determinate set of arrangements or selves in relation to its certain interpersonal bonds that are created and agreed, or orientation to the future in terms of credit and faith. So this leads to a number of big paradigm shifts in a number of different dimensions. In the trilogy, I conclude that an economy is only very partially understood when we see it in terms of a market, because a market imagines some kind of barter situation of instantaneous exchange, but most of our economic relations are actually contracts that endure over time and establish enduring bonds. And that has a different kind of relationship, different power structure, different situation. If you have a whole set of obligations or bonds, you're not in the same situation as if you've just got a set of commodities in your shop that you can buy and sell as you wish. And also our economy, we often use this word capitalism as though it's building up accumulation of stock or accumulation of means of production. But in the contemporary economy, destruction of resources yields profit just as easily as construction of resources. So it can't be properly understood primarily as capital, and it can't even be seen as a system aiming at wealth, efficiency, and effectiveness, because in terms of what it produces as much poverty as it does wealth, as much wastefulness as efficiency, as much exclusion of people from the economy, from a wider set of economic interactions, as it does inclusion. So I think the paradigm shift needed, and there's quite a few, and Devin mentioned some people, quite a few people who are social theorists of debt who are working with and within this paradigm shift, is seeing an economy as a mutual binding of imagined obligations, or these ritualized obligations that we collectively produce, the directed activities that result from them and accord with them, and the investments of trust, to the point where I'm seeing capital as essentially a certain kind of almost magical power to invest something with trust and significance that becomes socially effective so that something happens. And this means that trust in a certain way of thinking about the economy, the modern economy, and I call this economics, trust will be trust in quantification itself, producing data, in pricing, in calculation, exchange, and profit seeking. But all this happens in reality in terms of money. When people are after profit, they're not after something, and I rarely use metaphysical as a kind of term of aspersion, but the way in which value and utility and preference, these are not real things. They're just imagined metaphysical realities. Money is real. Money is real because at least we work with it. It has some definite institutional presence in the world, whereas value, utility, and preference do not. But a kind of trust in this picture of reality is part of the system. This means that the way I look at our current era, which is often described by broadly new left critics as the era of economic neoliberalism and financialization, and I very much value their narratives and realized quite early on that I'd never be able to write these narratives as well as they do. But for me, I'm not seeing this as a fundamental change in economic reality over the past 40 years or so, as some see it as quite a rapid change, which would assume that the previous post-war decades were in some sense the norm. But instead, these are responses to crises and things that affect further crises that disclose economic reality itself, that part of economic reality is a belief in the freedom and justice of a perfect market. And that is an active component that enables human behavior in line with that to be guided so that it becomes consistent and predictable, could be modeled by equations as if human freedom was in some sense mechanical. Likewise, finance, which is on the one hand trying to create all the missing markets to make the market more perfect, where knowledge is imperfect, well, there's bigger transaction costs, and it's trying to overcome all these. It consists entirely in terms of debt, but there's no substantial difference between the kind of debt produced in the financial, the process of financialization over the past 40 years, and the process of finance that's found in the creation of debt that happened in the financial revolution in England 3 centuries ago, that is in some respects, obviously it's many other respects that happened earlier, but in some respects, the foundation of our current economic system. And there's something about the way in which these things do not quite fit with reality. On the one hand, in a market, you can model it with equations, so it's determinist, but it's about human freedom, and that's a thing that makes you scratch your head. And then finance is geared towards the settlement of debts and obligations so that we can just go away and leave each other alone afterwards. But its means of facilitating economic transactions is by perpetual deferment of settlement of debts. And it's these kind of contradictions, this mismatch between being and thinking, that generates a whole set of conflicting constraints that destroy wealth and freedom and trust in practice and lead to our messed up state where we ask for, or people end up asking for much more of the same in order to solve the problems. Likewise, I then come to a kind of paradigm shift in our understanding of politics. If we make the question of trust central, trust as the creative power, trust as what enables us to cooperate, then of course politics has always been either about order, establishing order, some kind of legitimate order, and emancipation from order when that order is illegitimate or oppressive. That's a huge dimension, but it's not the sole category in which politics is to be thought. Likewise, it's not simply to be thought in terms of power and resistance or a struggle for recognition. That there is, beyond that, there's the wider question of the investment in public trust in various different ways. So how do we establish public trust? And in most societies throughout most of history, religion has been fundamental in extending trust from interpersonal relationships within defined local communities into wider relationships with strangers. It's made an economy possible, a wider economy possible. But the trouble is, every empirical criterion that people set up as some kind of criterion for trust leads to a situation where some people then are just judged as trustworthy and others are judged as untrustworthy for various reasons. Or they're judged as those who don't respect the criteria for trust and so are threatening to pull the whole system down. And this leads to short circuits of exclusion at the expense of long circuits, inclusion. And I suggest that justice needs to be thought in terms of this kind of dialectic is problematic. On the one hand, you want as much trust as possible. On the other hand, you want as much inclusion and justice as possible. And the two are often working against each other. There's a paradigm shift in terms of metaphysics, how we do philosophy at all. And typically in the past, this has been done in a rather abstract way. You take some basic concepts like necessity and possibility or substance and accident and try and establish what are the eternal realities, space and time, etc. But when we think like that, all that we achieve is sort out what's involved in our presuppositions. If you think in terms of possible worlds, for example, you're just really looking at your own presuppositions. There's nothing to read, nothing to learn from that. But I'm suggesting that we could have a concrete, local and provincial metaphysics. This is strange because it's going to be intervene and relevant at one time, and then it's going to be discarded as insignificant at another time, which is not about things that are detached from reality, but is the depth dimension that you find in specific landscapes or crises or institutions or structures it's not a matter of just pure concepts, but actually the material that's useful for thinking is something that someone has actually thought or narrated in terms of a story. It's something that has a named individual attached to it. And it concerns, and this is perhaps the metaphysical dimension that emerges when we think, and you could think about all the world in all sorts of ways and narratives in all sorts of ways. But the metaphysical dimension comes up when we ask the question of the forward orientation in life, the forward orientation of thought. What are the live problems faced? Which concepts can we use as instruments of perception and recording? How are we going to distribute our sense of how we spend our time, our attention, our care, what we trust? How are we going to express and refine our faith in what matters? What grounds the reasons for things, or what illuminates the truth of things? And I'm sorry I presented this in a very abstract way, and I try in the book to make it much more concrete. But there's this shift in the nature of what I'm by no means the only person doing this, but not many people are announcing that what they're doing is specifically metaphysical. The whole set of cultural theory is engaged in projects like this. But it's a fundamental paradigm shift about what it means to think. Now, I'll try to keep this short. There's less to say about religion, but I have understood religion for a long time as having an economic dimension that concerns how we use words to create things, to redeem things, to judge things, how we use words to and actions and behavior to order our time, care, attention, trust, cooperation, devotion. And there's this strange precursor for this way of looking at religion. And it's what Devin was mentioning earlier, that in the New Testament, particularly the synoptic parables and the Q sayings, they go on all the time about estate management, tenants in vineyards, about feasts, about homes and lamps and inheritances. The economic dimension of life is to the fore, and yet you don't learn how to manage a household by reading these stories or narratives. So I'm suggesting that there's a precursor to the work I'm doing in the recorded teachings of Jesus, which are not the same as what's been brought out in Christian theology, in terms of the way in which it concerns the economic dimension of life, the way in which you manage your own body and your own thoughts and your own household, and the way in which you manage interpersonal trust. I would divide up history into various periods. There are periods when trust has been primarily local and interpersonal and ritualized and tradition-based. There's been times when trust has been extended and facilitated by world religions. But we live in a world in which world religions are as important as ever, and yet their role in providing trust is short-circuited by something that seems more efficient and effective, which is bureaucracy and governments and debt-based capitalism. And this massive shift in human affairs to how we manage public trust which I think arises out of the financial revolution, has absolutely enormous consequences for the creation of modernity and how we think about things. The outcome of modernity is a world of contingency, of invention, of projects, but also of crises emerging out of these. And I think there's only two ways of addressing this or thinking about this, that at some point we might have to give up on notions of free market capitalism and become fully deterministic and have a regime of governance based on algorithms and data collection and daily nudges that's going to do all our thinking for us and tell us how we should behave so that so that our planet can survive, or we can return to this future orientation, and a future orientation which isn't just a matter of projection, how things will go in the future, but is a complete rethinking of the nature of time. Time is what comes towards us. Ideas are what come towards us. Some of them have a capacity to realize themselves in reality and produce entirely fresh kinds of reality. So the machinic versus the religious perspective is where I end up at the end of the trilogy. So just in summary, the 3 books, Credo and Faith is where I'm looking for sources for ideas, the economic, reading the New Testament, reframing what philosophy of religion is, the genealogy, which is not so much a historical genealogy as starting from seeing trust as what generates cooperation and economic value, to see how that gets expressed, handed over, immersed in specific institutions until eventually it becomes pursuit of self-interest, which obviously happens historically. Then the second volume, Economic Theology, is more of an update of my Theology of Money book. It's an analysis of the current predicament with sections on economics, on disequilibrium dynamics, and on finance. And then the third one is the strange book that's about to come out, that takes off in somewhat different direction from what I've done previously. Still concerned with economics, politics, religion, but through the metaphysics that I set out, that distinguishes 3 kinds of goods that we can seek after: the goods of appropriation, where what is mine cannot be yours. So I've got this water here. If I drink it, no one else can drink this particular water at this time until it's been purified, etc., etc. So that's kind of good of appropriation. There's goods of participation, which are institutions or ideas which only exist, these collective interpersonal ritual products that only exist insofar as we participate and share in them. And then seeing grace as this potency of ideas rather than as some kind of automatic mechanical necessity that's entirely predictable and the basis of which you can project. And basically, I argue that we have an everyday metaphysics, an everyday understanding of what is wealth, it's collateral or land, an everyday understanding of power, it's the power to keep your word and persuade other people, everyday understanding of necessity as what you can predict or describe through science or ancient technology. And I'm suggesting that these are not very effective or wealthy or good ways of understanding what is the deep structure of the reality we know, and which could be understood much better as appropriation and participation of grace. I'm going to leave it there. Sorry if that's gone on a bit too long, but it summarizes what the 3 books are about.
Thank you, Philip. I'm going to pass the moderator's torch to my colleague Carl Raschke for the remaining of the session, partly because Carl's work deals with this, all of this as well. Yeah, Carl, do you want to jump in here?
Thank you, Roger. Thank you, Devin, and thank you, Philip, very much. We've got a lot to talk about here in an hour. I want to say procedurally, if you want to, everybody on this, we call it a seminar rather than a webinar, which technically doesn't allow other people to participate other than the talking heads. But if you want to join the conversation, you want to ask a question, or maybe you want to make a comment, if you could do one of 2 things, the preferable one would write your question in the chat, or just raise your hand, which is under the reactions. I think it's, reactions down there at the bottom and so forth. And we'll take it in a sequence in which you raise your hand. But at this point, I want to give our 2 discussants an opportunity to kind of talk to each other for no more than 10 minutes, please. Are there any quick remarks you want to make to each other. I have a general question that I want to throw out, and it's a very broad question. You might want to think about this. There's this word that has come up only sparingly, but in your presentations, but in many ways, in my thinking about it is the linchpin. It is the key. In fact, it is in some ways, I think Devin said it, that it really is what the larger philosophical issue is all about, and that is the question of justice. I've always been fond of telling my students, that it's not accidental that the kind of foundational book we all read in Intro to Philosophy 101 is Plato's Republic, or Politeia, as it is in Greek, which starts out with the problem of justice and ends up with the problem of knowledge. Most of us think philosophy is about the problem of knowledge, but I would maintain it's about the problem of justice. And of course, I think and what Devin is talking about is the kind of theological infrastructure which is in with so much thinking about credit, faith, economy, economia, but also political and social issues. Right now, the kind of watchword is social justice, as if we need to really add the word social to it, because it's about justice. And the question of justice seems to kind of dominate over all of this. And so I'm wondering if you have anything both to add about that or to say to each other about what justice means in this larger economic context, or talking about economics in the very broad sense of the Greek meaning of the word household, the kind of dynamic relationships that involve the everydayness of life, the world that is given to us in our transactions and our various participations and so forth. I find Philip's new book that's coming out, which he was so kind to share a PDF to Roger and I, is fascinating in that respect because it's what he calls the metaphysics of trust. This question between trust and justice. We tend to think of justice very much in terms of how it comes out at the start of the Republic, giving everybody their due. But then the question of what is their due? We have a term for that now, which seems to be, sort of overpowering, and that's the question of equity, so that we don't really understand. It's kind of about balancing things out in a way in which somehow moral human relations become truly moral relations and so forth. But the question of a metaphysics of trust is both a whole new way of understanding economy, but also of understanding justice and understanding also what we might call the metaphysics of human relationships, which is what we all seem to be talking about in other words. So that's just kind of my comment. I don't want to, kind of eclipse the conversation here. I was just wondering if you have any more thoughts about that and or thoughts about what each other has said. And if we could just take 10 minutes and then we'll let anybody jump in that wants to.
I'll kick us off then, just to sort of respond to that, and also some thoughts that Philip has provoked. Yeah, Carl, I mean, it's a huge issue. It's definitely, I think it looms, in the background and in the foreground, I think, for both of us in various ways. And so one issue, I think, is this issue that I named, that a lot of our conceptions of justice seem to be structured with notions of measure, quantification, that they've been economized. And I guess a live question for us is whether, are there other conceptions of justice that don't need that? And certainly this is part of why these, what some might see as these kind of too abstract and reified debates about the gift that Derrida engaged in, but to turn toward questions of justice, right? And so someone like Derrida would say that we need to make a distinction between justice and law and legality. And I think that's an important thing to think about, right? So maybe it's the realm of law and legality, which is where this kind of enforcement of quantity and compensation happens. And then justice is this thing that, of course, for Derrida, like, we never fully realize it because we can't capture it, because it shouldn't be and can't be quantified. So that's one attempt, right? That's a philosophical attempt to think outside of these kinds of economic categories. And we can argue about whether that's successful or not. Levinas, of course, has his response to that of actually arguing that money is justice, right? So I think it's helpful to think though about distinctions between morality and ethics, law, legality, justice, and then these other categories that Philip has introduced, trusts, right? And one of the questions and thoughts that I had for Philip, and I think it relates, is this issue. I loved what you said in your slide about determinacy and focusing on money as being determinate. And it's something that's come up for me a lot in thinking about debt. That one of the hallmarks, it seems, of debt and with it money economies is this focus on formalization, making something explicit, making something determinate. Whereas trusts and gifts often, at least it can be argued, operate in the amorphous, implicit, qualitative realms. So I wonder about this role of determinacy. I think it relates to Carl's question of justice, but it relates to these broader issues of economy. Like, is determinacy the background condition here? Is there sort of this human need that's evolved that we need to make things, that we need to stipulate, that we need to concretize, that we need to formalize in certain ways? And is it the result of a lack of trust, or are there other issues that have kind of raised this? And this links with the question of writing, of philosophical debates link with writing as somehow a failure, because the verbal oral encounter is actually where authentic relationality happens, and writing inserts a kind of formality and distance there. So I think it's linked in with that. So that's one thought. I'm interested in the provincializing metaphysics, and I want to ask about that, but maybe I'll wait and we can talk about this first issue a little bit too.
Philip?
Thanks, Devin and Carl. That's some really interesting issues. To start, and I have no idea what I'm going to say, so I'll have to start where we were just now with formalization and making things explicit. I think that's a good description of the way in which I see what we do in the modern world. That we've lost trust in trust. And I see this with a kind of cultural revolution that has swept through universities over the past 30 years. The invention of new systems and bureaucracies, but this is just a kind of microcosm of a whole process of rationalization and modernization that involves trying to replace relationships of interpersonal trust that are often quite paternalistic or rely on patronage or open to all kinds of abuses and injustices, with systems of procedures in which we can trust itself. So I would see you almost make this metaphysical gesture towards, in what you said, Devin, towards a human need or something in human nature. And I would say it's not necessarily something in human nature. It's about distrust. It's about a situation where we're less and less rooted in and at home in our communities, our traditions, our customs, our experience, all the things that used to guide human communities. So we're trying to invent other kind of mechanisms so that we can trust in the mechanisms, the systems and procedures, instead of trusting each other, because we know that people often make a pretty bad job of things. And this is deeply ambivalent. It clears away all sorts of abuses, but it also leads to a whole set of constraints and determinisms, so that we become progressively more and more functionaries in a system that we don't really know or understand or don't know what we're doing. We have less and less individual freedom and become much more people who are tending a kind of machine, a big social machine. And that's, following Vey's Oppression and Liberty, that's the account that she gives of well, human nature in general, human societies in general, but especially modernity. So that I don't know if she ever read the good research, but as though she's taken Marx's notions of subsumption under the machine and generalize them to the way in which society works in general. So it's, to me, that I see the root of that is trying to use being in a situation of distrust and crisis, and then trying to use that situation to create things that we can then trust. And it's about the general insecurity of modernity. And if I can try and tie that into justice, that in some ways, the way in which we treat justice in terms of quantification is about inventing some kind of calculus through which we can be sure that we have measured and done justice appropriately. But the trouble with distributive notions of justice, I find, is that it presupposes some kind of utopia of equality, which is purely imaginary, because everything real in the world is different and likenesses are artificial creations. I think the way in which we imagine justice is probably based on an artificial projection, which gets us into further trouble. So the way in which I handle justice in the new book is primarily through imagination. I mean, I've gone back to Augustine, and although I wouldn't want to reproduce quite a lot of his conceptions of justice, and a lot of Cicero is reproduced by Augustine, the notion that understanding things at their appropriate level, the things that we can handle and control and are subject to the human mind, the things that are human minds like us, and the things that guide and orient and direct the human mind, if we can keep understand these at their own appropriate level, then that is a form of justice. That is a form of managing your own thoughts, a kind of an economy of thought, as well as managing your actions and your bodies. And I think justice has to be thought in terms of self-management, not just in terms of distribution. I should pause here to let others come in.
Okay, we have quite a few questions here and a few hand ups, but as I said, I'll go in the order in which they popped up on the screen. So the first one is, we also have some comments. I'm not, if you have a question, but you put it as a comment, if you could raise your hand and elaborate on it. So this one is from Joshua Lawrence. He says, Philip, can you say more about the distinction between appropriation and property? Hard for me to think appropriation outside of some of the kinds of hoarding, collection, purchase of goods, which I think you are pushing against in the forthcoming work.
Okay, yes, good question. They seem so similar, and obviously in the forthcoming work, I make a distinction between property as something that you can put a fence around or claim a right to, and appropriation as actually inhabitation. And they're quite different things. So you don't actually have to nominally own what you inhabit. You can pass through an area regularly and feel that you live there. And I say that your workplace can even feel like home when you spend some time in idle conversation or whiling the time away, or not really doing any directed activities. Then at least you're dwelling there, and that you don't own it. You're doing a job, but it's in those moments of break, reflection, imagination that that you're in some sense appropriating the world around you. And I think that's especially so. The paradigm I had in mind was the way in which I'm influenced by so many writers to the point where they feed into my unconscious, and then I completely forget who they are or what they've said or how it's influenced me. And in fact, most of it happens at the unconscious level. So I'm thinking of appropriation as something closer to that. And it's not only about ideas and thoughts, it's how we relate to the material world around us. It's our way of inhabiting and living a kind of life on the basis of something, which doesn't necessarily involve hoarding or collection. But there's more on that in the book.
All right, thanks. So the next one comes from Joshua Ramey. It says it's an open question. Is justice even the issue anymore? Isn't it always too late for justice? Interesting. Justice as a form of reciprocity, a corrupted category for reasons that Devin suggests, linking gift and debt. If I have to reciprocate, I have to have something to give. And where would I get that if not from inequity? For either of you to answer, I guess.
I mean, I think, yeah, that's definitely one of the issues, right, Joshua? And I think, I mean, that's a struggle. I mean, I think there are, obviously alternative ways that people have tried to conceptualize justice in more qualitative senses or relational senses. If you think about, but even, and I think about restorative justice, et cetera. I mean, there's still an implicit quantification there, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's tough. I'd love to hear your thoughts, Joshua, on that. If you think there are alternative ways, or if it should be if there should be a kind of pushback against the category of justice.
Okay. Yeah, Philip, I also would like to hear what you have to say about this. But I also want to reveal where that question is coming from, is because I've been thinking a lot about notions of blackness that come out of Afro-pessimism, but also from Moten's work too is not Afro-pessimism, trying to think kind of outside of modernity and outside of civil society from the point of view of those who are determined, that is ontologically determined, right, as those who have nothing to give, even when they appear to have a lot to give, even when they contribute a lot to the society, apparently, in terms of arts and culture and so on, right? They're still, because the Black is still positioned as the inhuman or the anti-human, right? We still don't owe them any reciprocity for what we nevertheless take from them, right? But the solution to that, at least if you follow this line of thinking, is not to sort of properly pay, Black artists and musicians, or even perhaps engage in reparations, although it might be more radical. The answer is to, as Willerson says, destroy the world, like actually end modernity, to end this paradigm that requires. Right. And I guess Derrida is still kind of bothering us here, right? Because it requires someone or something X that is completely outside the entire possibility of reciprocity, or the entire potentiality of relations that can, whatever you want to call them, it can be compensatory, that can be redistributive, that could be, even reparative or something, right? And I don't have anything more than that in terms of my own this is something I'm thinking about a lot right now, and I owe the Black radical tradition for provoking me to think this in the last few years. So I just wanted to reveal that's what's behind it. There's something very concrete behind this. I'm not, in other words, like I'm not coming at this just from a kind of Derridian, ooh, this is a really interesting, logical, transcendental structure. I mean, this is very concretely, historically, how modernity is constituted, right? So that's one thing I'm thinking about a lot.
If I come in at this point, and probably won't say much that's satisfying, but I've always had doubts about notions of reciprocity and considering justice in terms of reciprocity, and because of the fundamental differences in kind that, particularly in our relations. I mean, obviously, in the example you've been talking about, Joshua, is important, but but a very different example is the relations to the non-human world, the environment. Of course, there are multiple interactions that take place across multiple registers, but I think to think those in terms of reciprocity is to invent some kind of abstract measure through which obligation is understood. And I'm just an old-fashioned liberal, really. I don't want compensation for anything I do, and I'm very ungrateful character who rarely reciprocates any favors that anyone does for me. So
I also hate.
I just I do think reciprocity is a very different thing from justice, and I go back to the Gospels on this. The justice has to be thought in terms of giving respect to that which matters, to giving respect to that which has potential, distributing credit, rather than, it's always got to be totally unequal. And if it enables things to happen, enables people to thrive and flourish and cooperate and be included, then that would be a much better sense of justice. So that in the Metaphysics of Trust book, I imagine justice, again, in terms of an imaginary city, but an imaginary city which is characterized simply by respect, where people think, oh, that's significant, or that matters, or that's appropriate, or that's suitable, and just guide all their behavior in that way.
Great, thank you. Lisa McCulloch had her hand up, which I know she's taken it down. Lisa, do you still want to ask a question?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Thank you. It's Lisa, just, I know it looks like Lisa. I wanted to take a step back and consider, well, I don't think talking about justice in the situation we're in today is going to be anything but an exercise in dreaming. So let's talk about the real world we actually live in. And it's a world that has been defined by capitalism, and we're now in late financialized capitalism, which is an end game that will destroy the planet if we don't find a way to stop it. And we have to ask what allowed this catastrophe to happen. And you know, it's a power game, and we need to think about this power game and how the different plays of it, like when you examine a game of chess, what happened in that championship, what was the first move, what was the next move. And if you look at it that way, kind of unwinding it logically the way, or unfolding it logically out of its beginnings, the way Spinoza unfolds the world out of God, or however you want to put that, the concept of God, based on the necessity, but what are the necessary steps that made this endgame possible, given all the forces that would prefer that it not go this direction. And so I look at early modernity and I see social political theory that is designed to shatter society into individuals. And you see that in Hobbes and Locke. What is their number one purpose? To shatter society and create only atomistic individuals. And what is the purpose of their theory? It's to give power to those that have a power to redesign society based on their interests. And they did that very well. And they had the power to recreate the bonds, to recreate the game from an organic religious society grounded in religious traditions and so on, to being all about markets and capital and redefining the fundamental relation between individuals as economic rather than social.
Mm-hmm.
And as a consequence of this, you might say that, yeah, there's still the kind of trust operating in this system. Yeah, it's a kind of naive, and it's a naive, clueless trust in traditional relationships on the part of the little people. The capitalists have totally shattered all of those systems, but the little people go on accepting the sense of guilt when they take on debt, and that they need to pay back their loans, and they need to work hard for every hour, for every $7.15 per hour that they earn, and they keep functioning on these assumptions of the social relations and of being a good person on ethical grounds. Do the capitalists look at things that way? Never, or they wouldn't be capitalists. They wouldn't be able to play the game they do. And so it's really a split ethic between those who abide by those traditional social relational bonds and those who absolutely understand that power is a game that functions quite the opposite direction. And they need the sovereign because they can't rely on trust. Why can't they rely on trust? Because everything they do is constantly showing, I can't be trusted. I'm going to take advantage. What I call self-interest is against the interests of all others, including the other capitalists, including, you know, it's the one big agriculture firm, its interest is against the other big agriculture firm. And they all have to, even when they collude, they're not doing it on trust, they're doing it on the basis of building their power. So they have federative power, federations of power, but it's all in order to, in the end, stab everybody else in the back and run away with the, you know, the greatest power. So to me, the only way to look at this whole system of the economic realities of modernity as a system of power, it's the only way you'll ever understand anything. And there's a really interesting economist who is, I believe, Israeli, but he's based in Canada at the University of York, and he analyzes capitalism as power. And he's an economist, and he does these elaborate empirical studies and crunches data to show, to demonstrate that it's a system of power. His name is Jonathan Nitzen, Nitzen, and I highly recommend him. And so trust, you would think, would be an Achilles heel for the capitalists, but in the end, what's happening is more and more, as the economy is no longer productive, and there's no interest in being productive, there's only interest in kind of grabbing the resources and these shortcutting, you know, cutting short so that you win billions in 3 microseconds on Wall Street, or whatever ways of grabbing. It's a vulture economy now. There's nothing left of the productive economy. As Yanis Varoufakis has argued, there's been a complete decoupling of the real economy, the productive economy, from financialized capitalism, which is, you know, all the money, the world awash in these trillions of dollars, it's all being used to buy back stocks. It's just the greatest stock bubble in world history. And so what are you doing, Philip? It seems to me what you're doing, you're thinking about reinventing society after the shattering. And after this power endgame, where, and this really goes to show, one of the things that goes to show is a certain truth that was understood well in Christianity by Augustine, that without love, there's only the devil. And what is love? It's those real relations that are the web of life. Those real relations, they're not just metaphysical, they're material, they're psychological. Every aspect of our being is enmeshed in a web of relations that is sustaining our life. And you know, this whole modernity has, the shattering of society has been a tragic demonstration that we need love, and that trust, what is trust? Trust is a form of love, in my opinion. You're not going to have trust without love. And that's why this whole system has taken us to the brink of a destruction of the planet, because all power is being used in forms that have no idea that they're what they call self-interest is actually just a nihilistic, purposeless driving toward, absolute destruction. That's my that's my dark picture of the world we live in today.
Shall I respond with one or two thoughts? I agree very much with all of that, Lisa. I've sometimes thought, if I can do anything to reverse John Locke's legacy in epistemology and the study of religion and politics, then that would be some kind of an achievement. But the kind of questions that I've been asking recently is, how did Hobbes turn from being this atheist that people would barely mention except with utter opprobrium, into an influential philosopher? How is it that John Locke's nakedly self-interest ideological justifications for the slave trade, etc., were received as, in some sense, an emancipation, a step towards progress and freedom and toleration? And I think we have to understand the relationship, the integration and the relationship between thought and society. And although I'm not a good historian and I'm not a good scholar, the way I've made sense of the 17th century that Locke's expressing, in some ways, is just a symptom of some of the kind of standard dominant attitudes that were around there, is that you have from Tudor England, you have this economy that's suddenly geared towards export, sheep export, craft export. It's growing massively. More and more relations are explicitly trading relations and economic relations. But there's this massive shortage of coinage. I know this seems arbitrary, but most transactions had to take place on credit in the literal sense of deferred payment. And this sets up a system of debt cancellation, clearances between different people's debts when things would work out, people were willing to accept that. It has a system where there'd always be a third party who witnesses a verbal agreement, who can explain what's been agreed. You have enormous amounts of litigation going on when things break down. But you have this strange economy that's an economy of trust and cooperation, whereby people do things simply on credit because they're asked to. They're contributing to each other. And it then becomes a situation of, on the one hand, beneficial cooperation, on the other hand, real risk of contagion. Because if you don't get paid by your creditors, so your debtors, then you can't pay your creditors and your good name falls. And so credit as that reputation, which can attract other people to give you what you need, or when you need to pay someone, you can get someone else to do it for you. That sense of credit is what was all important. And this is clear in the diarists like Samuel Pepys or in the writings of Daniel Defoe on the complete English tradesman. This sense of credit leads to this strange Puritan, and I'm not with Faber here, a strange Puritan ethos where if you're diligent, if you're clearly visibly working, if you're thrifty, if you're not wasting your money, then and if you're pious and you clearly take your life seriously and expect to be judged by God, then you are credit worthy, your reputation rises, and you can do more for society by means of your credit. So somehow there was this connection between pursuit of honor as pursuit of credit, as pursuit of self-interest, and the way in which you contributed to society, and also the suspicion of the poor who were accused of hanging around in alehouses, who weren't worthy of credit, who were wasting their money and wasting their time and their labor. The suspicion of them for being the ones who are actually undermining society. And so you have this moral system which very quickly converts into individualism. The moment you replace coinage, which was out of where there wasn't enough of it, it was very poor quality, you wouldn't trust a lot of it, it was defaced and wrong weight, etc., and really old. You replace it with paper money, which is all the same, except there might be different serial numbers, but otherwise it's the reputation of the Bank of England, for example, that you're trading with, not your own credit, your own reputation. Suddenly it becomes the honorable sociable thing to do is to pay with bank money, because then you prove you have substance, you prove that you're not leading to the debt contagion, credit bubbles that the South Sea Company was an extreme example of. And you get this strange way whereby pursuit of self-interest starts to converge with for a bit and then eventually displace what had seemed to be working for the common good. So whereas in a more traditional Republican society, individual honor and the social and the common good are intimately tied into each other and work together cooperatively, that once we externalize that trust and put it into money, then suddenly self-interest starts to take over, and there's more to it than this, but then individualism starts to become possible. And that's led to this strange world that on the one hand, it has broken apart society, and on the other hand, it's built it more intensely as much as ever before. We don't live in a society of complete wild anarchic freedom. We have all our bills to pay and our debts and our constraints and our expectations for our careers, etc., etc. Everything is much more regulated and managed than before, and it's become much more machinic.
The only thing I would add really briefly to this is, while it's without question that Locke and Hobbes are some of the philosophical architects of what we're dealing with, that they're of course writing as reflecting upon certain historical material realities. I think one is this dynamic that Philip has mentioned. I think a couple others that are essential to keep in mind, of course, are the closing of the commons, which provides a kind of material historical foundation for Locke to theorize, as well as Hobbes. So that's happening before their writing. And of course, slavery and colonization. And we can't understand Locke or Hobbes on the state of nature without understanding their fantasies of the savage in the wilderness, which are informed by encounters with indigenous folk and the colonial encounter, right? So these are kind of historical material realities that are undergirding their philosophical systems.
Great, thanks. Alan Richard had a question way back that's still relevant to this discussion. Alan, do you want to jump in here now or rephrase it or add to it, or?
Well, it was a question about Philip's presentation really set up what seemed to me to be a tension between regimes of trust and justice. And the only reason that would matter to me is the exclusionary part, that it seems like the more you have a regime that's built on trust, the way that it was described, the more there is an exclusionary practice going on, because there are these criteria of trust. And in fact, if you just look at the example of slavery, the way that race-based slavery was set up in the United States, it really did start out with Christian versus heathen. And it had to do with exclusionary criteria for who you could trust and who you couldn't. Mm-hmm. So I want to I want to see if Devin and Philip can talk a little bit more about this tension. And I know we kind of resolved it earlier by saying, well, justice, we're not really interested in that. But but there's a certain notion of justice we're not interested in. But there is also, presumably, we don't want to repeat this kind of exclusionary practice. But it does seem that the way that the regime of trust was, or regimes of trust were being described, that's inherent in it. So what is a way in which that can be negotiated, I guess?
If I can jump in real quick before giving Philip the floor, because I think he'll have a lot to say about this, but I wanted to kind of add to this and kind of complexify this, because I would, while I think it's unquestionable that in modernity we are seeing a proliferation of systems of distrust, whether we want to talk about bureaucracy, money, contract, etc. I also would want to push back against and problematize any sort of simplistic kind of trajectory of the pre-modern world as a world of trust, the modern world as a world of distrust. And I think Philip certainly wouldn't want to say that, but I think we could interpret his project in a problematic way, if we took that incorrectly, right? So I think, and I take your point, Alan, to also be kind of pushing back on, there are ways that trust can be problematic. Right. And I think you've put your finger on that. And so, but I also wonder if, we've always been as a species, this mix of trust and distrust. I mean, we can look at, I think, archaic forms of ritual and tradition as modes of distrust. I mean, why we should, we think about modern bureaucracy, but it's a kind of ritual as well. So I think rituals of encounter, rituals of exchange, these are ways to stabilize ambiguity. These are ways to deal with the other, with the stranger, etc. And so I do think that there's a complex sort of play of trust and distrust in a variety of historical periods. And I wouldn't want us to kind of come away from this with a kind of nostalgia for a past that is full of trust that we've lost. Again, I think we can think about these forms of engagement with different communities, and certainly human communities are always encountering others, strangers, and there's war and bloodshed and conquest and slavery at a variety of moments, going as far back as historical memory and before that, right? And of course these instruments of debt and money emerge, of course, easily 5,000 years ago, right? If we want to kind of go with Graeber, but also with others, with Hudson and others that are kind of mapping this. So it's been around for a while, and I don't think it's unique to modernity. And so I think that complexifies this.
I think in a nutshell, it's the fundamental political problem that's universal to all kinds of societies, from the most ordered societies through to anarchic movements. How do you reconcile trust and justice? And if I had the answer to this, I'd have the kind of formula for Kant's cosmopolitan future. In terms of the direction we should head in, I think leaving behind notions of comparison is to recognize that the principles we've largely used for the allocation of trust have been working rules of thumb that have had some kind of functional role in different societies, but have always produced deep problems for lots of people and for relationships between societies. So there aren't really models to go back to on this. So we still need invention, we still need to learn, we still need to redirect our sense of what are the ultimate grounds for trust. And in some sense, a society in which there is inclusion, in which everyone's given the opportunity to flourish and cooperate, in which the wealth of so many is not just simply squandered in terms of their potential and what they can be and do and achieve in all sorts of different dimension ways. It's that we need to work towards, which is a nice image, but how do you get that without trust? Well, I suppose when I was thinking about this talk, I was going back again to this image of a dissipative structure that trust is a bit like. I know what you've got, that credit is going to be sending out in all the entropic directions in all sorts of different ways that usually get completely wasted, but it might bring back in more eventually than it's sent out in the first place. And that we have to build our society as this negentropic set of relationships that continually grows and includes and gathers new dimensions, and it involves more and more diverse kinds of interactions. That's not a good answer because it's such a hard question, and I'm waiting for people to slam the new book on. This is the bit that I get sleepless nights about, that I've not solved this problem properly. But at least I posed the problem.
But Philip, isn't that exactly the opposite of what capitalism, all the basic principles of capitalism, isn't it exactly working in the opposite direction?
Yes. Yeah, that's the aim, to move in the opposite direction. That capitalism works as a system of increasingly short-circuiting relationships of trust, and which I contrast sharply with Christianity in its original presentation as a system of distributing and wasting deliberately systems of trust. And I'm on the Christian side here.
You know, if I could just jump in here quickly and make an observation, it's, I think, one of the most underanalyzed philosophical figures in this whole regard is Kant. We talk about Locke and the theory of possessive individualism and so forth. But Kant, in his Metaphysics of Justice, or Metaphysics of the Elements of Justice, takes what is essentially the moral issue of Christianity, which he's trying to turn into not faith, but what he calls pure reason or a moral faith and so forth. But then when he tries to actually concretize it, which he does in the Metaphysical Elements of Justice, he bases it all on appropriation and, loosely speaking, property, or the right of someone to command another. And that's why in my latest book, I've argued that Kant is the first neoliberal thinker, because of that particular kind of transformation. This whole question of the relationship between trust and possession or ownership or domination, all those are triadic in terms of the same power structure. What Lisa was talking about is economics as power makes a lot of sense here, particularly when we go back to what is that epical era, which all this comes into being, which is the 17th century. Not only the beginnings of capitalism, but also the building of capitalism on the backs of African slavery primarily, and the development of the New World, so forth. So I think, in some ways we have to look at the kind of transformation that goes on in Kantian thought and Kant's influence. All right, I just want to say that, but we have probably time for one more question here, which is from Adam. And I assume he's still here. He may want to elaborate, but I'll read his question, which goes back a ways. He says, it gets into a little different area. It gets very theological. With the murder of God that you discuss in Capitalism and Religion, modernity has burdened itself with modeling the world, and its primary apparatus for this task is money. Money's attempt to approximate or model all human relationships. The two political tendencies that have arisen from the secular world can vulgarly be described as capitalism and communism, or liberal democracy and social democracy. Isn't the problem the idea that we could grasp or model reality with in an economy? Adam, do you want to add anything to that quickly?
Yeah, because that was as best as I could form the question at the time. So the first chapter of Capitalism and Religion is, in my copy, mostly margin notes now. But the idea has stuck with me that part of the problem in thinking I was thinking about questions of justice when I wrote this. So part of the problem, I see it as posed or enlightened to me by Philip, is that the secular world is obsessed with an economy as the thing that stands in place of the world, or it can only grasp the world and its relationships as an economy. Thus, that there's some ability then to set up relationships of exchange between classes or individuals. And so it seems to me that the problem that is put forth by Philip is that perhaps an economy isn't actually a picture of the world, and if being is closer to something like hexaity, where there isn't exchange possible, then aren't the two political tendencies, major political camps of the secular world, they're incapable of answering their fundamental questions of how do you model the world? Is that a question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's an interesting consideration. I don't see capitalism and communism as too different, really. Essentially, I see them as it's either about individual ownership of the means of production or collective ownership of the means of production. But I see them both as capitalist in the sense that the means of production counts. In terms of this attempt to model the world, and I think this goes back to what Devin was saying about the human tendency to model and formalize and understand things by making things explicit. This is clearly a tendency that's as old as writing or older still, but it's something that has taken on force within the modern world because it's been a way of managing relationships of trust and distrust. So the kind of 17th century epistemological revolution, which involves a complete distrust of not only the evidence of the senses, the idea that the most obvious thing that we see around us is that the sun is going around the earth, and that's wrong. So you now got to have a totally new system for establishing the truth, and you got to have some kind of explicit method and some way of agreeing these things. I think that's a very important aspect of modernity in the modern project, to the point where sciences, even economics, is no longer trying to copy physics or trying to be a deductive science or mathematical science. It's only just trying to construct models. You gather as much data as you can, you feed them into a computer, you see if you can find a model that will fit and describe what's going on. And that, to me, seems to be a way, it is motivated ultimately by the desire for prediction and control, the desire for controlling your own conduct to maximize your own interests within that, but also the sense of mastery over nature that this is designed to solve is in some sense an expression of insecurity and distrust, that the world is no longer a place in which one has a place and is at home, and which one is adapted to by one's culture and customs and experience and traditions and rituals and practices and economic practices. And I think it ultimately goes back to sorry to sound so chauvinistic, but it ultimately goes back to an English problem of enclosure and land ownership and the colonization of the English landscape. And people often say Ireland was the first colony, but but I want to say my ancestors were colonized first. I know partly it's a Norman Anglo-Saxon thing, but that understanding, this distinctive English understanding of property and enclosure, it has somehow led to a position of insecurity whereby suddenly we're looking to put up loads of fences, we're looking to make everything explicit. It's driving this process that at the time, 2 decades ago, I was calling capitalization in the chapter you refer to. Perhaps I should stop there.
I'll just put in a quick plug for power and sovereignty here as well, in the sense that while we can certainly, I think, find situations where money spreads almost like a contagion, because as Philip says, it lends itself so easily to helping mediate these issues of trust and distrust, and the kind of monetization and financialization of everyday life that many theorists lament is evidence of that. But we can also find plenty of accounts of resistance to monetization, right? Particularly in colonial accounts where, in incursions into territories, and there's an attempt to impose currencies on a conquered populace, that there's just a resistance and intractability to using monetary categories. And so that's also interesting to think about, how discipline, power, and sovereignty are often needed to sort of enforce and basically force people to use money and use monetary categories as well. So it's not always necessarily spontaneous or imminent to communities, but it's something that has to be coerced as well.
Okay, great. I see we're out of time, and I know people are having to slip off to other appointments, so this was fabulous. Thank you very much, both of you. We need more conversations about this. As we develop, I hope we can, especially when Philip's new book comes out, which really takes this whole thing in a different direction, which I find very exciting in a lot of ways. Maybe we can figure out a new way to format these conversations, which are just massive in their implications. Before everybody goes, I want to tell you that our next critical conversation, which will be toward the end of June, it's either the 22nd or the 29th, we'll have a European scholar who we're going to introduce into the Anglophone world for the first time, who is getting a lot of attention in Europe because of her new book. Her name is Isabella Guanzini. She's an Italian philosopher, theologian who teaches in Austria at the University of Graz. And her book in Italian is called Tenerezza, which translates simply as tenderness. Zärtlichkeit doesn't sound quite as fluid in German, but I've read her book in German, and it's fantastic. She's offering a whole new way of looking at how we relate to each other in the world today, with binarism of digital media, globalization, and so forth. She's gotten quite a lot of, even though it's a quasi-academic book, she's gotten a lot of attention in the sphere of public intellectuals in Europe. A lot of major reviews already in both the Italian and the German press, German-speaking press. So we're going to introduce her to an English-speaking audience. Her English is good. I happen to know her personally from a number of years back, and even though the book isn't translated into English yet, we'll try to summarize it and get the view, and then hopefully we are going to be able to promote a translation, because it's a fantastic book, and it's totally kind of throws a curveball the way we usually approach these kind of issues and so forth. She, by the way, her background is Lacanian psychoanalysis and theology, so it should be a really interesting exercise, and I hope you can join us for it. So I'm going to thank Roger, and especially for the work he's done with us. Roger's stepping down as general editor, though he'll still be what we all do as a consulting editor with us for a variety of reasons and responsibilities. And so we would just want to thank him for all the way he's gotten these critical conversations going this year. So just give a thumbs up to Roger here. And thank you, everybody, for participating. We'll hopefully see you next month, or see you soon. And please, if you have something to write for the new Polis, please send it to us. You can send it to the editor. We have several editors who are handling things. We're also restructuring and adding people. So thank you very much. See you later.
Thanks, everyone.
This will be probably in a week or two. Will be up on video, and we'll even have a printed transcript of it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Good to see you all. Bye-bye.